Thank you very much. Morning, and to share a little bit about the story about AI from IBM. I'm here joined with a colleague Simon, who will take us through the latter part of the seminar when he talks a little bit about the demonstration of how this scenario planning advisor that we're going to talk about is going to work, and I will set off the introduction. And on the slide here, you also have Michael and Antonio. Michael, thank you for helping with the slide setting up. He's our expert in this area, and Antonio is our expert in natural language processing here in Australia. So with the talk itself, I'll split in three parts. We start with a small introduction to IBM research, probably just to position who we are in Australia and who we are in the world, and a small introduction of how long we actually have been working on AI, so that you have a bit of an appreciation of how artificial intelligence and IBM go together. And then we'll dive into the material of today, the enterprise risk management and the scenario planning advisor. And then at the last part, we'll run through a kind of a demo, but how we use the scenario planning advisor in practice. So the IBM is a large company that started research just after the Second World War, and it is now a capacity of about 3,000 researchers that are spread across 12 locations in the world. We have got 4 major positions in the Americas, 4 in Europe and Africa, and 4 in the time zone of Asia Pacific, India, China, Tokyo, and Australia. And we in particular are living in Melbourne with about 100 researchers. It's a broad church. It's not just a research group that looks at computer science, but it looks at a very broad respect of the sciences. Actually, anything that has to do with the future of computing, you can find in the IBM research umbrella. And we're in good company with 6 Nobel laureates, and that's a good indication that we're not computer scientists, because engineers and computer scientists can't be eligible for Nobel prizes. Medals of technology, yes. Medals of science, yes, and Turing Awards are definitely in the computer science boat. It's a broad church, as I said. Anything that matters to the future of computing is basically found within the IBM research stable, and you'll find people going from behavioral sciences, seeing how the brain actually works and how we react and how that basically intelligence is being used, all the way to physics, computer science, mathematics, EEE, electrical and electronics engineering, and the materials that we use in order to do compute. All of that you can find within the center of IBM research. Our presence in Australia is essentially around the computer science and the EEE, I would say. Mainly artificial intelligence. That's the topic we talk about in Melbourne. So about artificial intelligence, the word itself was coined by John McCarthy in 1951. And he described it, and you have here a picture of John McCarthy in his young days at Stanford, and then just after his retirement. In his young days, he basically described this whole field of artificial intelligence on the basis that he felt that we had sufficient understanding of learning and intelligence that we can emulate it by a machine, or a machine can start simulating it. Just a year before that, Alan Turing had asked the question, can machines think? And so John took that a step further. Although I don't subscribe to this notion as being a precise statement, I feel that if I only knew how intelligence really worked, I could teach better, and that's certainly not the case yet. But what you can see is that AI has developed over the last few decades, and it became a collection of software and hardware that is able to emulate learning in many different ways. And we use tools in data science, optimization, to extract functionality, essentially, to learn something. And we can do that either by a supervised learning technique, when we use label data, some modeled by teacher, or self-learning, unsupervised learning, reinforcement learning, and that particular when the goal for which we use an artificial intelligence narrowly and well described, precisely described, so that we can capture it in a computer language. The related stuff and what we're going to talk about today more will be based on the natural language understanding of computer, and that is still very much a developing field. And I would say that in natural language processing, that language understanding, a lot of work has still to be done. And also symbolic reasoning, how we can use logic. And although computers are based on logic to a large extent, at least if you talk classical computing, actual symbolic reasoning runs into difficulties because of complexity associated with it. And that's also a field of research. Artificial intelligence, just to make sure that we don't get the wrong impression that it all started with John McCarthy, and that Barry's law, 1980 physics, tells us nothing is ever invented for the first time. And just to make sure that Barry's law is not invented in 1908, I quote you the Bible and King Solomon, who says in Proverbs, there is nothing new under the sun. So the whole idea of creating artificial intelligence has been a quest of mankind and humankind for a long, long time. And you can go back to mythology to find examples of robots and things like that, that people were thinking about how can an automata actually think. And there are lots of examples throughout the generations about that. But nowadays, because of our understanding of biology, where we copy intelligence from, psychology, how we behave and how we observe intelligence, essentially, using the language of mathematics and engineering, we can actually start thinking about artificial intelligence. And there is a lot more needed, but the technology is becoming of a maturity that we can actually do some amazing things. And in some places, we have already achieved what I would call superhuman artificial intelligence, where we can beat a human learning in a narrow area. In the narrow AI, we actually do quite well. Broad AI and so on is still difficult. By the way, I put here a small picture of Ramon Cajal's collection of neural networks. Ramon got the Nobel Prize in 1906 for physiology. And it's his drawings and understanding that our intelligence is based on these intricate networks of neurons working together that has led to the idea of artificial neural networks. And here you see an example of a highly hybrid system. It's a retina, but where you see photon receptors, photon conductors, and 4 layers of neuron processing with lots of dendrite and synapses working together to produce images. It's a remarkable device. I'm not going into it, but it's a really important piece of biology that has given rise to an understanding of how to build function approximators, neural networks. So a bit of the evolution of AI and where we're at for the moment in 2020. On the one side, we have the dream. Machines that think. 1950, Turing's paper. By the year 2000, we'll have machines that can outperform humans in normal behavior. That was at least a dream. Now we think it's a little bit harder, the problem, and that we'll still stay away for it for a few more decades working on this before we're going to see machines that are able to do really fluid thinking. Fluid being we have learned in one area and we can start applying it in a different domain naturally, easily. Some things that humans seem to pick up very naturally and we find quite easy to do. But for a computer, extremely difficult still. So still a way to go, something we aspire to, something we work towards, and much of AI nowadays is working on that idea. Can we actually represent that human behavior in machine? On the other side, the narrow AI, there we have lots of examples. Simple systems, starting with the complex rule-based systems, based essentially on understanding of if I have this data and that's the label for this data, how can I bring those two together? Correlation analysis. We know how to do that extremely well. And in some of these areas, we already have machines that do much better than humans can do. For example, in chess, nobody is going to beat a chess computer anymore. They are better than what we can do. We spend more time well, if we could spend more time thinking about chess alone, we might be able to get there. But for the moment, computers can learn much faster than we in that very narrow domain. And therefore, chess, nobody is going to try to beat the chess computers, chess master anymore. In these narrow tasks, lots of examples can be found where computers can be trained to do them more accurately, more repeatably, sustainably better than humans. Hence, artificial intelligence outperforms humans in very narrow tasks. In the middle is where we're sitting for the moment, is how do we go from these narrow tasks and start building hierarchies of AIs that work together and work with multiple forms of data, the multimodal, and in particular, how can we do better with natural language working? So in here, we start asking questions like, can we reason with data? Can we do logic with data? Can we reason with language and bring things together? We're slowly seeing emergent ideas and examples of that. And in some sense, the scenario planning advisor I'm going to talk about fits in this broad AI narrative. Just a little bit of the history to show you they're close by the beginning of when AI was actually coined as a term. We started in 1945, so a few years before the term was coined, but actually some form of artificial intelligence research was going on at the time at Columbia University, where IBM started. We have at this point in time with the team that we have more than 20,000 engagements where AI is at the core. And that covers all areas of human endeavor, from medicine to climate change and climate work, energy, computer science itself, and IT, how we actually do IT better with artificial intelligence, and finance sector, just to name a few. A very large portfolio, arguably the largest AI portfolio in the world, which goes from computer emulated or computer specifically designed for AI, all the way to workflows and algorithmic algorithms for AI. Recognizing that despite the fact that we've got 3,000 people working on this topic, more or less, that's not enough in a way to get really to the fluid understanding of artificial intelligence. So we also partner a lot, and one leading partnership in this space is the well-known MIT IBM Artificial Intelligence Alliance, where particular thing actually to algorithms and complexity of artificial intelligence are high on the agenda, and where we're working together. On the right-hand side on the slide, you have a number of examples of where IBM had a first, and you see also a little bit the way we set ourselves challenges to solve AI problems. In 1959, Arthur Samuelson was the first one to create a narrow AI that could beat anybody at playing checkers. 1997, well-known Deep Blue beating Garry Kasparov. 2011, we had a challenge where we won the game of Jeopardy, and Jeopardy is where we actually find the question given an answer, and with certain probabilities you have to try to figure out what is the crux of the question that's being asked. So that's a time where you see some broad AI coming together, deep domain knowledge, but also language processing. Computer has to understand a significant piece of text and information, textual word information, before a decision can be reached. And then in 2018 we brought to the table a debater, an algorithm that can construct within a college level debate an argument and can counter an argument of another debater or partner in the debating, and he can actually debate for and against, which is an interesting, again, an example of where you see a deeper understanding of knowledge and synthetic and appearance of text that is pleasing to the listener, which is a debater essentially. So a little bit about natural language processing and why it's so important, why it features so highly, especially in the later challenges that we set ourselves, is that when you look at how data is being generated, and human data in particular, most of it is available in unstructured textual information. And that is very hard for us in some sense. If as a researcher you want to stay abreast of your field, it becomes impossible to read the literature. I'm just scared to see how many papers just were written on COVID-19 in this small period of 6 months. It's already far larger than any doctor, anybody working in the space can actually read. So can we actually gain the essence of that information? That's one of the questions we're trying to ask ourselves. So how do you understand language and summarize information for cooperation? That will be an important aspect of scenario planning advisor. For the moment, it's still, I would say, statistical-based, rule-based, or narrow AI, but we're slowly seeing deep learning, broader AI, bringing the several domains of understanding of language coming together, so that we're starting to see broad AI appearing in our natural language processing. And if you realize that every 2 years, the data volume that we have to work with basically goes up by a factor of 10, then you realize there's an awful lot of information that we have to start summarizing. We have to learn to forget in a way. And summarization is trying to say that's essential and that is not essential, given a particular angle of looking at the data. And it's a very important piece of question that we're starting to answer within natural language processing. So that's the introduction. Now let's go into the enterprise risk management and the scenario planning advisor. And like Terence said, this risk management understanding grew out of IBM's own interest in understanding what its risk profile was, and in particular what its financial risk profile was. And within that environment, we have enterprise risk management as an important aspect of running our business, and also now as an IBM consulting practice. And the cycle of risk management always starts with, what is the risk I'm exposed to? What is the identification? Can I assess that? Can I plan for it? Can I then deploy a resilient plan for minimizing my risk? And then I observe what is actually going to happen. And then, of course, things are going to happen that I didn't think about, and I have to replan. And this is not about being able to find black swans, but being able to respond to it, learn from it, and then improve. So it's a continuous cycle of risk management and risk management improvement in a way that we are talking about. And there's a whole practice of how to do that manually. But given that data becomes so large, we're thinking, how can AI be infused in this process so in order to make it better and easier to work with? And a few of the key challenges that we are trying to propose is, how do you observe from your data what risks are being, if you like, enabled by the environment? At that one, then allows you then to talk about planning for that risks that are more likely to happen than the rest of the risks that you may have anticipated. So the scenario planning advisor does that by creating a view of the future. And we call it plausible futures, things that may happen. And we then explore these potential futures or plausible futures through an understanding of what are the cause-effect pairs that are there. And that's important to understand, that this is not based on statistics. This is not based on simulation. So it's not like a weather forecast. It's not like saying, I know where the tornado starts. I now think the path is this way because I understand Navier-Stokes equations. This is not what this is about. This is more about human behavior. This is about understanding, if I see a fire, then I probably have to have something that can stop that fire. So it's an understanding of the environment around us, and then understand this and bring these together. And by concatenating cause and effect, we can build plausible futures. So the logical concatenation of cause-effect pairs is what underpins SPA, not simulation, not statistics. It's a viewpoint of the world seen through, if you like, an expert eye to believe what can happen if I see this cause happening, then this effect will happen, that effect can cause this, etc. So what the scenario planning advisor will do for us is to create a graph that will represent the future, and the graph will consist of concatenations of plausible events. I know a cause, that cause will lead to this effect. I have a cause and effect. They will be part of the nodes in the graph, and they will be linked by this. The pairing of it will be due to the fact that I have a cause effect, so I can indicate an arrow, if you like, that goes from the cause to the effect. That's basically what we're talking about. If we do that, we can get very complex answers. And the important bit here that we try to overlay on it is that we want to simplify that graph for our interpretation and working through shining the data on that graph, saying what is actually relevant in all these cause-effect pairs that I'm looking at, which ones are the ones that are relevant at present in my environment, and can I then understand what the causes, the effects are of the things that I see at present, and therefore get a better, maybe less uncertain viewpoint of the future. And the whole thing here is about trying to be quite objective. So trying to do all of this work before we analyze the risk. So we're not in the middle of the risky environment. We're actually outside of that. And we're trying to see all the aspects that can bring all the aspects that can be brought to bear on that particular event. So it's an example of broad AI, and I'll explain in a second why it is actually broad AI and not a narrow AI. Remember, this is not forecasting in the sense of certainty this will happen. There is no data about the future. Forecasting the future is always uncertain. This is not magic ball glazing, by the way. What we are trying to do is avoid statistics and avoid mechanistic models. So it's only using expert knowledge. It's all about this unstructured data that's available of the way we understand the world and that people may have written down. And in fact, for the example today, we have tried to pick some of your public domain documents around the uncertainty environment that the Air Force has to operate in. And we have tried to extract out of those publicly available documents what the risk model may look like. So it's about mining data that exists, descriptions of the past, events that have happened in the past, and how we've reacted, trying to understand the cause and effect pairs out of that environment, and then using these to see what may happen in the future. And finally, because you always want to have some importance and some immediacy in this as well, we have to infuse that. This is not always immediately described in the documents, and so we'll interactively work with the expert to be able to say, well, if you see this cause, how long will it take before you see a particular effect? So we can look at the duration and how long lasting will this effect be. These are type of questions we can try to get out to the documentation, but we also will evaluate this against the experts itself, so that the whole idea of getting the information will also be overlaid with the information from the expert, and you have a curated viewpoint of what you believe your risk environment will be. And so your graph will be weighted in such a way that that information is also being captured. And that allows you then to navigate more important or less important things depending on the environment. At least the theory for the moment, keep that thought in mind. You will see this in action when Simon actually walks through the example in the demo. This is a far too complicated map, but I just want to illustrate here the idea that if we do this by just putting all the expert information combined together, we get very quickly extremely complex webs and graphs that links causes and effects. And this one in particular about the Afghanistan problem. And we look at that and you say, ooh, you get cognitive overload. So what SPA tries to do is to say, well, this may be all the intricate web of cause and effect pairs that are there, may be linked to a certain depth of how cause and effect pairs are concatenated. Can we simplify this? Can we interrogate this data? Can we interrogate this using information that comes from the environment? And we may say, well, actually, from this whole graph, there's only one point that really is important, because we have this event seen in the environment, in the data. So let's see if that actually cause has happened. What are the effects starting from there? And we can cull the rest of the graph away, and then we can work on a much simpler graph to work with. That's the whole idea. So we can then highlight, if you like, those aspects of the things that are happening now, and we can de-emphasize the things that we don't see data for at this point in time in the present. And we have to change it, of course, if in the future other causes are also being activated by the data, then SPA can be iteratively used to also augment and see that part of the graph in action. So underlying all of this is this one important notion of cause and effect extraction. That's a text analysis that is not simple because it is quite a binary relationship of this causes that. And for that, we use an engine that uses a large large corpus of data, preferably, and we try to identify there what are the causal statements in that environment. And then because causal statements are found, we try to identify what is the cause and what is the effect. Now, people use lots of words in lots of different circumstances, and they have different meanings. So we have to overlay that and say, well, I may talk about a particular cause. I may say, for example, complexity. But another person may say, actually, I see uncertainty. And another person may say, I see instability. But from our point of view, there may be three different words that actually mean exactly the same thing in the context of what we're working in. Instability leads to uncertainty. Uncertainty is a part of complexity, depending on whether maybe I have a computer science point of view when I like talking about complexity. If I have more an engineering point of view, I might talk about uncertainty. And if I'm a dynamical system person, I might talk about instability. But I mean exactly the same thing. And for example, that object I may be talking about is climate change. It's a complex object. It is subject to large uncertainty, and it's actually coming very close to instability where I can't predict anymore the future from a mechanistic model. Same words, three words, same object. One of the things we have to do here is to find that how are these words embedded and mean the same thing. And for that, we have a semantic embedding engine that, again, looks at words and what they mean and allow us to put the conflicts together of these words. So we may well say that complexity, uncertainty, and stability in the context we talk are one and the same object, and that they are the cause of, say, further uncertainty. That has to be identified. And that's why we have the semantic embedding engine there to identify the similarities. Once we have those, we can then put all our cause-effect pairs together, we can group them together, and then can present them to an expert. And given that languages are very much dependent on the context in which we use them, we often then ask for an expert to come in and to see whether the computer understanding of that environment is actually to our satisfaction or not. And that loop will help us to iterate and improve the model for that particular context. I'll give you one simple example. It's a little bit esoteric, but if I'm a logician and I talk about buildings, I'm actually talking about sets of axioms. And a building is a context of consistent axioms. There's nothing to do with buildings that a civil engineer may be talking about or buildings that someone who is an architect is talking about. That word building is preserved for the domain of logic. That's something that is very difficult for a computer to figure out unless we have sufficient amount of data in the textual database that we are using to identify that that word is a very specific meaning that doesn't come out of the Oxford Dictionary necessarily. That's a point where the expert is coming in. And SPA has tools embedded that allow you to do that relatively painlessly and quickly to improve your model and to have the language correctly used. Now, I'm pretty sure that within your own environment, you will have use of language and words that are going to be less common in the normal language, but they are specific to your domain of expertise. So, what an SPA tries to do is to build these plans that explain the observations. So that's planning-based plan recognition. And what we then try to do is, of course, to eliminate as much as possible the uncertainty that we have from the data and the incompleteness of the information that we have. And dealing with incomplete information is a particularly complex object in computer science. We like to have complete data, but here we have to recognize that we'll never know everything. There's always going things that we don't know, and therefore we want to allow incompleteness either in the information we can gather and try to present as complete a story given incomplete data. That's what the technology has to do. A little bit about the complexity of SPA itself. Because it has about cause and effect pairs, if you just remember the number of cause and effect pairs is the most important concept here, and basically how big your graph can be. These are all the nodes essentially. On the bottom axis here, I've counted the number of cause-effect pairs, and on the vertical axis, the relative time to plan essentially. So to find these graphs, if you like. And on average, you see this yellow curve coming out. So at around 2000, say that that's 100%. If you have something that has much less cause and effect pairs in your graph, then you're going to deal in very, very short periods of time. But if you have something that grows a little bit bigger, say to 5,000 or 10,000 cause and effect pairs, you will see suddenly a lot larger demand on the compute time that you require. The way we break the nexus here is to what we call K-star heuristic searches. We don't allow all the depth of cause-effect pairs to be plotted in our graph. We say we only take the K-star most important ones, K being a number that you want to pick, and then we try to organize the priority and say only the K important ones we're going to retain in our graph. And that will then severely restrict the way the complexity of the algorithm is going. In principle, this is an NP-hard problem, and it can take forever given you have enough cause and effect pairs to work with. But by breaking it in this way, by saying I'm only going to focus on the important ones, I can bring it almost back to linear, slightly above linear complexity. It's this n log n type understanding where n is the number of cause-effect pairs, which will limit how fast and how big a graph we can actually explore. So it's an important thing to remember that in principle, we're dealing with something that computationally seen is extremely hard, and we say NP hard in general. So when we start building our models, what we start with, and in this case, with the example that we started, we have basically taken some examples out of what does fifth generation air battle actually mean, and rapid force projection planning and so on. We have a number of documents. There was not that many documents we found. I think we've got 4 or 5 documents that we've taken out of the website. We've done a causal extraction on those. Those causal extraction gives us a number of drivers and futures and causes. We then iterated on a few of times that whole process to figure out more drivers, more cause-effect pairs to build a reasonable graph, not a very deep graph, but a graph with 4 or 5 stages of cause and effect pairs. So we have a fair amount of understanding of what one cause can lead to, what effect and what type of impact it could have for the business as a whole. And then we try to increase the viability of the use of this graph by asking questions like, how plausible is this outcome? How likely would it occur? Would it immediately occur? Would it take a long time to occur? Will its effect be long-lasting? How big will be the impact of this type of technology or this type of cause? And that allows then us to color or weigh the graph and get a better representation of what are the important elements in the graph, what are the cause-effect pairs that are most likely going to occur, and how are they going to affect our business outcomes that we are interested in. So the feedback iterations that are here are normally moderated by the human. So the human will see the drivers and the cause-effect pairs. They are asked, do you accept these? Do we have cause-effect pairs that have not been identified as identical, that should be identified as identical? Have we clustered too many? Do you want to break it open? Are there more nuances in the words than we have allowed for? Those are type of questions in the first iteration. And the second iteration is more to do about what is your interpretation of the likelihood? What is your interpretation of the impact? What's your interpretation of the time duration? That can be conflicting because different subject matter experts will have different opinions about these things, and the computer will take a statistical average, a weighted average of the information it has available. If you don't want to answer it and say you don't know, it will not be counted. That type of stuff will be taken into account, and that finally will then give you a colored graph of your risk model given the data that you have available to work with. Then we can interrogate it. And the interrogation happens in a number of ways. We can say we're particularly interested in integrated air defense, and that will then give a highlight of a particular part of the risk of the graph that is there. And then we can ask ourselves, well, yeah, but you say that is important to you. Can you actually find evidence in the present scenarios that are around you, the data that's around you, that that particular risk driver is relevant, yes or no? That's what we call the awareness module. And the awareness model, together with the scenario projection planning module, will then allows you to start looking at what are the feasible futures for that particular integrated air defense as a particular driver of cause and effect pairs in your graph. What you put in the awareness module are, at this point in time, limited by what we do by the news. So we have news feeds, and a lot of the news feeds you will see are actually from our financial environment, because we've got a lot of particular interest in the financial environment. But in principle, nothing stops us here to use other news feeds that could be fed into here, and it could be also email trails between people that are interacting with this particular model. The information that we have there is essentially textual information coming out of the environment meaning the organization, being the newspapers around it. And what we're coloring it is to find out what is the driver that we have identified, how is that reflected in this news data. And if there is nothing to be found in the news data, we say, well, this is a hypothetical scenario. You're interested, but we can't find the evidence to support it that this is actually a driver that's relevant at this point in time, at least not in the data that we've presented. That doesn't mean it's not important. It only means that we don't have evidence or awareness of what is in the environment for the data feeds that we have provided to the model. The two combined, if you have a driver that you've picked and is important to you, and it's also important to the environment, that would, of course, be a heavier weight in this particular analysis. So I'm going to stop here. And Simon, I'm giving you 10, 12 minutes to run through it. My apologies. I should have spoken a bit faster.
Thank you, Iven. Before we get started, I'd like to sort of just set some expectations. Doing a live demo is always difficult in these sorts of situations, especially when using a sort of unknown or new platform. So we decided to minimize the risk, is to show a series of screenshots from the actual SPA application. So what you're seeing here is essentially the graph model that's been created previously, and we'll show the graph and the use of the system first, and then we'll go through the stages of actually building the model. Next slide, Iven. So you can see that there's quite a bit of complexity in this graph, and you can see how the cause and effect pairs are sort of shown and how the concatenation appears in the application. The yellow shaded nodes in the graph are what we call business implications. So they're sort of like the end state that we're looking for in the plausible scenarios. And they provide us information about, well, where might this scenario end up? Next slide, please. And at any time, you can zoom in and you can actually click on a particular node in the graph and actually show all the precursor nodes feeding into it, so all the causes leading to that particular effect, as well as anything sort of after that particular item. Next slide. And so Iven mentioned about sort of the weightings of the graph, and these are qualitative weightings. They're not statistical or probabilistic measures. And if we zoom in a little bit, next slide, we can see that we have the concept of likelihood. So that's never, sometimes, often, always. Then we have the impact, which is showing us what is the impact of a particular cause to the effect. And that is low, medium, or high. And then we have the duration. The duration is from a particular cause, how long is it going to take to reach the effect? Some things can be very short. Other things can actually take quite a bit longer. So that's sort of going through the graph and how it appears. Next slide. So then building a scenario can start with looking at the state of the world around us. So as Iven mentioned, we have this awareness module that looks at news feeds coming from around the world, as well as it can be built with user-defined inputs. And especially this is important in a sort of defense intelligence community where we might have classified information that we want to feed in. And what the system does is it actually looks in the news feeds and the articles for actual particular drivers that appear in our model. So you can see in those little bubbles are actually the drivers from the model that we just shown. And it uses those semantic embeddings to ensure that it's not just a keyword search, but it's actually looking for words in the articles that have the same meaning. Next slide. So if you click on one of the rows, you can actually see all the articles that are related to that cluster. So that's the other thing we do. We cluster the articles together into logical groupings. And you can actually click on the link there and actually go to the article and read about it for more information. Next slide, please. So once you've sort of decided on the driver that you're interested in, you just click on the little bubble. It appears up the top, in top of the screen there, and then you click on the Generate Scenario button. And at this point, we actually get shown the potential or the plausible scenario that the system has generated. So you'll see on the far right is the integrated air defense. So that's the driver that we actually chose. And the information preceding that is actually what some of the indicators are. So what are the things that might lead to integrated air defense? So industrialization, digital transformation, digital revolution, those sorts of things. We also show a probable and possible grouping. And there are thresholds where you can set of, you know, how probable or possible do we want to set the engine to generate. And this is where the weightings come in, because it uses those weightings to work out what are the most likely events or effects from a particular driver. Next slide. So we can also view this scenario as it appears in the graph model itself. And we can see as we zoom in, next slide, we can see that the selected driver, the integrated air defense, is highlighted in green. We can also see the indicators, so some of those precursors are shown in blue. And again, then we can see all the paths leading to our various different business implications. Next slide. We can also specify or look to a particular endpoint, as you can see here in the red on the right, and we can then examine what were the different paths that are possible to end up at that potential implication. And so it dims out parts of the graph that are not relevant. So that's how we sort of utilize the application to generate scenarios. And as Iven said, you can also do a what-if type setup where you can choose your own driver out of anything that's in the model. And therefore, you don't necessarily have the evidence from real-world situation, but you can examine what might happen. So now I'd like to change tacks and actually go through how we build this model. So the initial part is to specify some drivers. So this is where somebody sits down and works out, well, what are the things that I want to build my model about? This is actually optional because the NLP processing of the documents that we provide that extract the cause and effects can actually start with no drivers at all. This is really a way to sort of prime the algorithm with some information that we're interested in. After we've selected those drivers, we then choose the documents. And if you can see the names here, you might recognize some of the documents here. As Iven mentioned, these came from the AirPower website, the publications page. And so we use these as a select subset to build our model. Next slide. Well, once we've selected our documents, the system goes off and analyzes those documents and extracts all the cause and effect pairs that it identifies. And then it presents us with a set of new drivers that it's identified by analyzing these documents. And you can see, I'm not sure if it's visible, but here we've shown 77 new drivers over multiple pages. And so that was coming from about 20 drivers that we started with. At this point, you can edit the drivers. If you don't think they're relevant, you can delete them. If you want to change their names or the information, you can edit that as well. Next slide, please. And then what we do is we go back to the beginning, and we've now got a much larger set of drivers to work with to prime the algorithm again, and it goes back to the document or different documents and extracts the cause and effects that it can identify based on this new set of drivers. And we can iterate this over multiple times until we've built a model that we think is comprehensive enough for our needs. Next slide, please. We then go and do some sort of hand tuning of the model, where we sort of group some of the semantic equivalent drivers, and we sort of delete ones that aren't valid. So here we have information technology advances, advanced information technology, and advances in artificial intelligence. Well, obviously, advances in artificial intelligence isn't quite the same as the other two, so we delete that and go on to the next one. Next slide, please. So there we show that we've deleted that one, and we can go through this as many sort of equivalent drivers that the system has identified. Next slide, please. And then we go and identify all our business implications. So that's sort of where we specify those endpoints. And any driver can be a business implication, and we can decide which of the drivers are of most impact to us. It also identifies drivers that are sort of orphaned in the graph and that might not have any sort of nodes feeding into them or nodes feeding out. And so we can also look at those to clean those up. Next slide, please. And at the end, you end up with a very complex looking graph. Obviously, you can't read this, but you can see that it starts to get to the level of complexity that model that Iven showed previously. Next slide, please. And of course, we can zoom in and examine any part of the graph as we like. The final stage of the setting up of the model is to actually set those weightings on the various transitions from cause to effect. So the system generates what are called these questionnaires, where you can specify how likely, what is the impact, and how long does it take to move from the cause to the effect. And you go through a series of these, and this is something that can be sort of spread out across multiple subject matter experts that can go through these, and you can get different sort of opinions, obviously, when you do this. And so the system sort of does averaging across the multiple questionnaires to end up with a graph, a colored graph that we saw before. Next slide, please. And next. And next. So that's how we end up with this colored graph here. And next slide, please. And finally, at any time, the model can be manually edited. Next slide, please. You can break connections, you can add new connections, you can add new nodes, you can change the weightings. So the tool, once you've gone through all sort of the automated stages of setting it up, also allows for the manual tuning and updates to the model. So as you can see, something that would potentially have taken weeks to months of subject matter experts sitting down and building these complex graphs, with the natural language processing and the AI behind it, we're able to take domain-specific documents and create a very complex mind map or graphical model in a very short, relatively time period. Next slide. So in conclusion, what we've shown today is the ability to build a scenario planning system that can generate multiple plausible scenarios and outcomes based on what's happening in the real world, as well as user-specified drivers of areas that they're interested in. The natural language processing to build the model for the causal extraction is very powerful. It's built on a generalized corpus that has actually worked in very many domain-specific areas. So because it is built on such a large corpus of information, it's quite generalized. And these graphs are very high quality because the system has the ability to have weightings and user input to help build the most plausible outcomes. And we have the awareness module that feeds into this to help us identify those initial drivers to look to see what the potential scenarios are. Some of the areas that we want to do some further work here is looking at whether we can fine-tune and improve the causal extraction with some domain-specific corpuses, and use transfer learning to enable using the generalized model as well as domain-specific model to improve that causal extraction. And there's, of course, further work that can be done in building the models, building the plausible scenarios, and the plans that are output. And also, of course, we want to have use configurable awareness modules that can range from domain-specific information and sensitive data in a sort of classified environment. So, Iven, have you got any concluding remarks?
I would say thank you, Simon, for collaboration here, and thank you, Saren, for the opportunity.
Gentlemen, thank you very much for that discussion. Obviously, a very complex tool and a lot of thinking that goes into the background of it. As a defence person, I guess I'm looking at it saying there's application of that type of model, not necessarily SPA, but that type of model across some of that slow time sort of forward-leaning wargaming or strategic planning concepts. But I'm also interested in how it can be adapted for near real-time analysis of a range of different information sources from different platforms and informing commanders on appropriate decisions in that near term. But I'll leave other people to ask those sort of questions. So for the audience, if you want to put some questions into the Q&A panel, we'll air those questions to Iven and Simon. To lead off, though, just to make sure we don't have dead air, I've got a question about the people sort of element of this. In listening to it and watching all the slides of the system, it struck me that there's a lot of work that goes into that background planning and making sure we've got the right information sources and the linkages are right and all that sort of stuff. Have you guys had to think about or got some information on what type of workforce is needed to maintain that back end of the system? And for Air Force especially, or for defence, I guess, what are the skill sets that we're going to need if we go down this AI path? And are they available now, or is this a future problem?
Okay. I'll give a first answer, and I think I'll give it over to Simon to specify how we're using it. As far as the background documentation is concerned, our simplicity of approach was simply to take some PDF documentation that you had curated on your website with respect to the environment you're operating and see what can we do with those documents. So I'm relatively comfortable that whatever is in textual information available, even a large database, can actually be ingested for starting the conversation and starting the process of developing risk analysis. On the other side, some people have done this already because, after all, there are whole teams of people doing this for companies, and they actually produce risk plans. And you can ingest these as well into the document engine. So we try to minimize the data curation to the extreme possible because we realize that documents will have a long lifetime. They will be created in different formats, but as long as we can ingest them in some form of a PDF format, we can start working with them and start interpreting them. The difficulty that exists in the language and interpretation of the language, hopefully the engine that we're using has a sufficient understanding of language to be able to overcome these. Even so, as time progresses and you have a very long time span of beginning and end date of your document, language may actually have sufficiently evolved that words mean different things. And that's a time when you will need to pick up that, well, the engine can't do that or doesn't have that information because it has probably too modern data or something like that. That's where you start having to bring in the experts, in my opinion. The experts here are essentially more of the kind of understanding what is important, what is not important, because that is very difficult normally to extract directly from the text. Cause effect pairs, principle, the engine does a reasonably good job. The number of drivers it finds, starting from 0, just giving the document find me cause effect pairs is not insignificant. And then you can iterate saying, okay, if I have already that, what else can you find? So there is an iteration process because it doesn't find everything at once. There are certain limitations of search that we have imposed, and otherwise it can go on forever, essentially. If you want to develop this in your own area and you're asking yourself, okay, what do I do for AI expertise? Then I would say, yeah, you will need people that can understand data science and computer science and NLP in particular to develop this further. But then you're asking a research question. The whole idea of SPA is to try to make this AI as user-friendly as possible, allowing for the limitations of the accuracy that we can achieve with natural language processing. It's statistics-based, it's not perfect, and that the iteration through the expert makes the engine better. That's the idea behind it.
Yeah, well, I think just to add to that, the intent of the application is not to replace the subject matter experts that are already in place doing these sorts of things. It really is to augment and add more information that they might not have considered. So the traditional way of building these risk models is getting these SMEs in a room and coming up with the most potentially outrageous but possible scenarios and mapping those into these sorts of graphs. The causal extraction not only gives you access to a much broader range of information because you're not limited by the people in the room, you actually can get documents that are available globally that could be from teams all around the world doing these sorts of things, as well as historical information. And the other benefit of the causal extraction is it removes some of the human bias that might occur by people doing this in a manual way. So I think we're not out there to replace people. We're really there to augment and provide them tools to make this much faster and easier to do.
Okay. We've got a question from Andrew Banfield that kind of touches on that SME versus machine sort of balance, for want of a better term. But he's asked, how do your results compare to a room full of SMEs creating a risk model? So for me, that sort of touches on, is a group of SMEs giving a better insight? And what's the temporal aspect of it? Speed versus accuracy or quality of analysis.
I can't directly give you an immediate answer on a group of SMEs regardless, but I do know that within our CFO office, we use the tool to actually help our SMEs to focus on the right and prioritize on the right type of thing. And they have been using it for a number of years, and in some of the more important markets, totally rely on the tool to help them to cut to the chase of how they plan for their financial uncertainty going forward. So they kind of rely on it. It has been built over time. So the SMEs definitely have had the input and the opportunity to hone the models that are being in use. That's number one. Number two, for the immediacy, especially when it's driven by the newsfeed and the awareness model, it is very unbiased. It basically picks up immediately in real time, if you like, what news feeds are going to play in your market. And so you, as an SME, you possibly can't read all the news that's available And so the computer helps you to digest that news feed and say, here are the things that I believe you should be focused on because they're important elements of our risk model that you are playing with. So it is an augmentation tool, just like Simon indicated. I don't think we are talking about being better than the experts. In the end, we are building on the documentation that is there. The only thing we can hope for is that given the fact that we have all the documents available, the more complete your data collection is, the more experts you have actually consulted, the better the model should be. But in the end, it doesn't do black swan events, and it's just another view of what expert knowledge is available in the environment already.
It's true for a lot of technology these days. It's there to augment the human brain, not necessarily replace. So there's still an analysis of the outcomes that comes with it.
That's
okay. There's also the
absolutely.
ability to start small. When you first start using the system, you can even build the model manually yourself to see how the thing works with your own information. And then as you sort of become more comfortable with the application, then you can start introducing more complex risk models and build upon that. So the model isn't static. You can start small and you can keep on adding more and more information, building more and more complex models.
Yeah. Jay Hansen has asked, how does the awareness model determine which sources to use? Does it just use everything that's input to the system, or is there a level of prioritization?
Basically, yes. So we have Watson Discovery for the news feeds. That's our major engine, which is subscribing to all the news feeds that we're interested in, and that's the one that we feed in. But in principle, that's a tunable parameter. One question we've heard once was, can you feed in all the emails that are going around in my employees? In principle, yes.
I didn't show it in the demonstration, is that there is the ability to filter those feeds. So you can, if you're, interested in people or companies or concepts, there is the ability to filter that news feed and look at the areas we're interested in. And as I said, one of the things we want to sort of add to it, and as Iven mentioned, is quite feasible, is to have user-defined what's to that news feed, and that can be domain specific, especially in defense. If this was set up in a private cloud environment, we could even incorporate classified information there.
Okay, we are having a few audio things, at least in my end. I'm not sure how everybody else is hearing that, so we might try and tidy that up for the video version out. So if you're listening in and not quite picking up everything Simon said, hopefully we can pick that up later. Hey guys, Andrew's asked another question. How much of the results depend on your initial input? And I guess he's talking about the quality of the input and the breadth of input. For example, if you have a new project with very little information available, how reliable is the risk model? So is it?
Okay, that's a very good pickup. So if there is little information about a particular topic, it's much harder to do anything with it, because in the end, it does use statistical information from language. So you're required to have a reasonable amount of data to work with in order to get a reasonable model. Otherwise, it will be very limited in what it can actually detect in say, one document or two documents. This is a classic difficulty also in debater, that you can debate an existing topic for which there is a corpus of data available. But if you had asked it, for example, the question, would a quantum computer outperform a human being, then you will find probably nothing of information that is relevant, and your debate will be very, very minimal ability, because it doesn't have information to work with. So yes, absolutely good pickup. If you don't have a lot of data, this is only going to be a tool to build up a model from scratch. and the AI is not going to be the great enhancement that you think it may be. It's only becoming a great enhancement provided you have significant amount of data to work with, and also significant presence.
Evan, is the system smart enough to be able to sort of do an analysis and provide like a reliability index or anything like that, or is that just too far?
At this point in time, I think the reliability comes through you checking the output of the computer. And if you have only one document, you're going to get very little back from the computer in terms of what cause and effect pairs are described in that particular document. It's relatively okay finding and analyzing a document, but and it infers cause effect pairs because it has a much larger document database to work on what means cause and effect in a sense. But it will not invent beyond the text that is there what potentially other cause and effect pairs may exist. It can only work with the data that has available. So that question is a question of fluid learning. A human can do that. It can say, I know from this domain, that's possible cause and effect pairs. So therefore I can infer in this new domain what may happen. The computer does not have that fluidity. It's stuck to, I've written this, I read this text, and this text has these cause and effect pairs. It will not
this next question, I would like to thank Radhika, if I've pronounced that right. Thank you for this question. You've definitely put me outside of my comfort zone, so I'm going to ask the question verbatim. Your views on the use of LDA, latent Dirichlet allocation, MCMC, Markov chain Monte Carlo, transformers, in brackets BERT, by Google, in addition to other drivers in risk model development. I hope that means something to you, because not me.
Yeah, it does mean something. So the deep similarity engines that are underneath here are actually going exactly in the same type of area. So these are particular ways of interpreting language and a particular cause and effect pairs. So that's definitely part of the engine module here as well that we are using. To what extent, I can't compare them completely. I don't know that technology sufficiently deeply to say how one compares to the other, but there are particular ways of interpreting language using deep learning models. And the deep learning engine is part of the deep similarity engine that is underneath here, and that's indeed part and parcel of the whole project. The Markov chain modeling can go a step further to some extent in that it can analyze the graph traces, but here we don't use statistical information. So it's actually not, strictly speaking, a Markovian approach that we are using because we don't have statistics for that. The graph based is purely based on, can it happen? We don't actually provide an estimate of probabilities around that. I hope that helps a little bit. That's quite a deep technical question. I'm very happy to have Antonio in the room working with.
So, Radhika, I can't say if it answers the question. I hope that does for you. But gents, there's no more questions in the box at the moment. But I guess, is it okay if we, if people want to reach out to you if they come through the FPR Centre?
Absolutely. Yeah, I believe you have my email address and Simon's as well. Antonio is not on the line, so I can't see his reaction, but definitely happy, and I will pass on the questions and also have facilitate the conversation, both with the designers of the tool as well as with.
Well, look, gentlemen, thank you very much for your time and your insights, and obviously the research and everything that's going on in IBM. Hope that continues. I'm comforted somewhat by the fact that Cyberdyne Systems isn't quite going to go self-aware anytime soon, but it's definitely a burgeoning area that we need to look at. For everybody else that's still online, thank you for being a part of today's webinar. My apologies for the issues we had in October, and there were some teething issues this morning as well, even using events there, but I think it's a much better platform, and hopefully you found it engaging as well. Please feel free to provide feedback to us if you would like. This will be the last webinar for this year. We'll be back in February. On February 25th, we're going to be doing a really exciting 6-person panel discussion looking at human-machine interface using Loyal Wingman as the backdrop to understand autonomous aircraft and all of the bits and pieces that goes into that. So from a technical perspective, from an aircrew training perspective, and all the way through to ethics and legal of having autonomous aircraft operating. So stay tuned for that marketing and register for that seminar. That will be actually physical at ADFA as well as going out as a live webinar. So pretty exciting next year. If there's no more questions come through, thank you again, everybody. And yeah, look forward to your feedback, and we'll see you in 2021.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you.